One of the things that we're often proud of as people who are long-time Delawareans, and many of the folks in the audience are as well, is that this is Delaware, the things that make us unique, our small size, our 3 counties, our 740,000 population today. And one of the impacts of that is that on our perimeter are a number of fine news gathering organizations. You know, you can start with the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, not to mention the presence in Delaware broadcast media from Baltimore, principally Baltimore and Philadelphia. What do you feel? What kind of impact do you feel that this competition from outside Delaware, on one hand, and you know, the larger voices that are remote from Delaware in that sense, has in terms of impacting the quality of coverage on one hand and the quality of public life in the other?
Yeah, I don't think it has a tremendous impact either on Tammy or on us. In the summertime, the Washington Post sells more papers than Rehoboth. That's no big surprise. And so does the Baltimore Sun. In northern Newcastle County, the Inquirer barely penetrates into our market. There are people who buy it. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, people who buy those newspapers will buy them, and they do. And they also usually buy the Delaware State News or the News Journal, because they're buying that for very specific reasons, national or international news or business news. I guess to some extent the Inquirer and the Post keep us on our toes a little bit because they do some coverage in Delaware, but not much, not enough to worry about.
Yeah, and they're not covering, when they do cover Delaware or issues in Delaware, they're not covering them for the readers in Delaware. They're covering them for their readers in their primary market. So the Philadelphia Inquirer is usually looking for something quaint, cute, you know, kind of like Delaware is a province, and you know, here's something that's happened that's unusual, and it's going to be a clever story. Or the Washington Post is reporting on all of the things that are going on at the beach for all of the people who invade in the summertime.
Although they started their poultry coverage last week.
Well, they did.
It's
Yes.
good pieces.
And probably 6 months after the News Journal did its, and the State News did its coverage.
But that might be also because that issue is elevating kind of, it's of interest to their people in their readership area.
We have in Delaware probably 10 or 15 radio stations, a couple of them that have strong news formats. We have WHYY TV that broadcasts its news programs from Wilmington, and we have cable, formerly Suburban Cable, soon to be Comcast Cable in Wilmington. What about the impact of radio TV coverage and the lack of a commercial base for the larger kinds of stations and enterprises that some communities might have? Any thoughts on how that's affected journalism here?
It's made us a little stronger, the print media a little stronger. I think that's one of the things that happens. But I think that we don't completely understand it, but I think that the spread of cable is going to change that, and the internet, where everybody can be a broadcaster, everybody can be a newspaper. That world is just simply changing. It doesn't matter where you are. Information, you know, is something that will be transmitted, sold, organized, and I think it's going to become regional at best, and national and international in all likelihood. That was a problem back in the 60s and 70s. I think it's no longer a problem.
Well, I think this state is because of its size and unique character, and the fact that there are only 2 daily newspapers in the state, really. There might be others that publish from out of state, and each has its own orientation, kind of upstate and downstate, that people in Delaware are very accustomed to and have a real affinity for print. And that's not to say that radio and TV don't have a role, because I think they do, and certainly for immediate coverage, for that kind of immediate, you know, this is what's happening right now. But I think in more than in some markets, Delawareans are pretty comfortable with print, and that's a good thing because you have to learn how to read, and I think it prompts a whole different way of thinking about issues and viewing the world when you digest information that way.
You know, and I think that there's a lot of crossover. I mean, I participate once a week on Channel 12 on one of their news shows, as do some other of my colleagues. I know that on radio, you frequently hear some of the print people, upstate and down, where they cross over and do radio and television. So
let me jump ahead a couple of questions, and one of the things that I had wanted to get to, which to me is one of the little interesting things, is I remember when the News Journal brought me to Delaware 25 years ago from Central Illinois. One of the things that I had a real sense of presence about was this kind of ongoing journalistic rivalry between the News Journal and the Delaware State News. I really have a sense that that's subsided in any significant way. How do you feel about that?
I don't think it's. Yeah, I think it's not as aggressive as it was 25 years ago, in the sense that both of us were sort of out front, chin to chin. Some of that has to do with the fact that both newspapers, because of the way the national trend in newspapers is to really focus on what they call the newspaper designated market. I mean, and so for us, our heavy focus is on Newcastle. Their heavy focus is clearly going to be on Kent. We both are still, I think where you see the toe-to-toe is in Sussex, which is, it's not theirs and it's not ours, really. And you have Salisbury creeping up. So if there's...
so you see...
I don't know, just the nature of the competition is just
a grand entrance. I think that the competition, I'm sure it's still there, particularly with the reporters on the street and the editors on deadline, and I certainly believe that it is and hope that it is, because I think competition keeps you sharp and keeps you on the edge and keeps you pushing a little bit, or sometimes quite a bit. I think that, again, that those two publications in particular have settled into kind of primary coverage responsibilities that are geographic in right now, but also I think that there are a lot of other things that we compete with that are sometimes far more important than the News Journal and the Delaware State News competing with one another. We compete for time, because a lot of people just don't have time to read newspapers. We compete with the internet. We compete with all other kind of media. So I think that the competition that's really the big runner out there would be non-print competition.
Yeah. Well, in that vein, let me
non-newspaper.
just ask to clarify one of the things that newspapers are always going to talk about are circulation. What's the kind of current update on where the News Journal circulates in terms of total circulation and the State News?
I think we're at 140 some.
140,000.
I don't know. On Sunday it's more like 155, and that's statewide.
Yeah. And we're in Kent and Sussex only, and we're in the mid-20s daily, in the mid-30s on Sunday.
Okay, very good. Before we proceed, let me take this occasion to introduce our late arriving panelist, Mr. Alan Loudell. Alan is a journalism graduate of my own alma mater, the University of Illinois, has worked in radio some 25 years, a large chunk of it in Memphis, Tennessee, and arrived in Delaware in a key leadership role about 10 years ago with WILM 1450 AM radio, and has really helped transform and redefine what radio news gathering is about in Delaware. He's done a tremendous job. As I said, his Rolodex would be the envy of many. Alan, I introduced you a little bit before you got here, but welcome.
Thank you, Sam. I'll just say in broad parameters, I think everything about the Delaware media in particular is very schizophrenic, unusual, a bit bizarre. I mean, example, there are more radio news people in Wilmington, Delaware than there are in Milwaukee, Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, Kansas City. Not so Dallas, because there is an all-news station in Dallas, but a whole lot of bigger cities. And the reason for that is probably three or fourfold. One, obviously we're underserved by television. We have a unique vacuum, a niche in the electronic media. And by the way, it's probably gotten worse, not better, with the changing of Channel 12's priorities, TV 12, WHYY, and also cable going to more of a regional approach as opposed to a Delaware approach. Ironically, although I decry it as a Delawarean, on the other hand, it's certainly made it better for radio competitively. The second reason is the great number of people in professional occupations in our area, CEOs, managers, educators, retirees, others who really care about news. And the final thing is what we call in broadcast media, duopoly. That is where one company is able to own a lot of stations, has not progressed in northern Delaware the way it has in nearly every other market in the United States. That is because the Hawkins family owns my station and we're not for sale. The Steinmans own WDEL, WSTW, although they've picked up a few other stations and made it into a regional network, but they too are a regional player, a family. They're not a big company. Frankly, stations like WJBR, WRDX, some of the FM music stations are more typical of what we see around the country where a big company has taken over and done things like that. It's ironic, just last night I was reading an article, it was out of a paper out of Virginia, and I can't quite recall the town, and the local newspaper columnist was decrying the end of local broadcasting in the morning because whatever it was, some AM station suddenly went satellite because the new company that took over downsized, and they no longer had local product in the morning. It was just a lot of national syndication. So in a way, I think we in Delaware are a little bit spoiled. In another way, competitively, frankly, if any operator tried that here, I don't imagine the results would be very lucrative commercially because people in Delaware are used to local. It's very, very unusual. All you have to do is go to Allentown or Harrisburg or another market of comparable size and see what the AM station is doing there compared to what WILM does or frankly what WDEL does. I mean, we do one national syndicated show in the whole day, Mike Gallagher 1 to 4, and that's primarily as a means to compete with Rush and Laura. DEL does Laura. That's it. The rest of the time, we are local live. Incredibly unusual in American broadcasting, and frankly, out of the top 20 markets, we're the only one of our kind left in the country. Also, incidentally, Mel Karmazin, who is the guy who shepherded Howard Stern through his career, is now the president of CBS. And so Mel Karmazin controls virtually every other all-news radio station in the United States of America. There are only 4 exceptions. KTRH Houston, which is owned by a company, WTOP Washington, which is owned by Bonneville International, which is owned by the Mormons, KQV Pittsburgh, which is owned by Richard Allen Scaife's little media empire, very far to the right conservative, and then WILM. Well, I don't know, I'm a little prejudiced. I've been at WILM longer than any other station in my career, but I like to think of ourselves as a minor star in the celestial heavens, so that's how we feel about ourselves with our local reporting staff and everything we do. And another thing, I was reading another article, it appeared in the Toledo paper, and it was about how the company had taken over a lot of stations, how the main news talk station in Toledo, WSPD, had been whittled down to a staff of 1 or 2, and the news was coming out of Columbus, and the local paper in Toledo filed suit against the radio station for piracy. Basically, the station was lifting rip and read out of the paper, which is a common problem. The newspapers spend the money to get the material, and then the radio stations rip it off. And that's what happens with a staff of 1 or 2, and it happens all around the country. I'm proud to say, and it's always leaves an impression with people. People say, well, gee, do you read The Wire a lot? And I say, well, yeah, I mean, The Wire's a supplement. Take a look at The Wire. You look at it, WILM, there's a couple WDELs. Most of the stories on the Delaware Wire, we provided The Wire, not the other way around. So it's a very different media scene. Now, and as to the future, and then we can go back to the rest of the panel, I would merely say that, is this running longer than the rest of you? I apologize. Well, last paragraph. I would merely say, I think in the age of the internet, in the age where the computer and new technologies marry print and broadcast as never before, where print has web pages with audio now in some major markets, we're going to see much less distinction between the various forms of journalism. I do think local, because, for example, long before, not too far into the new millennium, I can imagine where you might be able to program music into your car. You'll be able to program the music list via satellite into your car. If you're an FM music station, you're not doing a lot of news and information, a lot of local community service. What is going to be the point of being on the air anymore? That is where those of us who are AM, which in many respects is dinosaur technology, are going to have the last laugh. Because these highly traded FMs, there's one in Philly that just went for $80 million. They're going to really have to deal with the new challenge, which is going to be technology a la satellite. And the hard local news stations are the ones that, in my view, are going to be survivors.
Thank you. Let's, as we jump back into this, and Alan, we kind of covered some thought-starting questions on stories of the year, stories of the century, news reporters, exported journalists. I don't know if you'd have anyone to add to our list, Alan, of people who've gone on to great celebrity and influence outside of Delaware. We touched on Joe Pine, Tom East, as a couple. I don't know if there's anyone else that, and we mentioned a few others.
Bill Frank.
Bill Frank. Well, as one of our homegrown legends. Anyone else that you think of in the broadcast media that has come from our state?
I think probably Joe Pine is the closest to national notoriety. Naturally, a lot of personalities have come through and been here for half a year or a year, and really never left a deep imprint.
If you take a look at your notes, we're about halfway through the kind of second area there that we'd covered on evolution. Let me go back, and Alan alluded to on radio the changing patterns of listenership with regard to how I guess the point is that compared to 40 or 50 years ago when people listen to radio at home more, today a lot of that radio listenership's in the vehicle. What about your impressions of changing patterns of listenership and readership? And incidentally, we are going to get to the new technology. We're going to start to look forward in a few minutes, and at that point we're going to start to talk about the internet and some of the other new technologies.
All of our readership surveys tell us that the value that we have is to be a local newspaper that, and Alan used the phrase local. To that end, we've started zoning much more than we used to in the past, in order to focus on different communities. And it seems to be, it's being met fairly positively. There's that sort of terror in the newspaper person that wants to do national and international news, as well as the local. But in point of fact, our expertise is that we know Delaware, and we can buy, and so can the reader, buy the national and international stuff in a great deal more depth somewhere else. So what we provide is Delaware, both in terms of organized news information and advertising information, which can't be overlooked.
Tammy, any changing patterns in listenership, readership that you find noteworthy?
Well, I think everybody, I mentioned it before, that competition for time, I think everybody feels pressed, that their time is shrinking and that they have to make every minute count. So I think that from a newspaper standpoint, you're competing for people's time, and you have to. You also have to be a lot of things to a lot of different people, and I think that is the challenge that print media faces, particularly newspapers, is to go forward and redefine itself a little bit in this kind of new era. But I think the real change in readership is the one that we're just beginning to feel. And I don't know that we really fully appreciate it, and that is that my kids, my son and that generation, they're not growing up necessarily with newspapers nearly as much as they are with computers and TV and multimedia approaches that are even changing the way they think about and categorize information or how they seek it out and approach it. And they are very demanding in what they want and when they want it. And I think that's the real coming change in readership or listenership even.
Alan, any thoughts?
Well, at WILM, what we've tried to do is provide the alternative. That means strong local news, strong local reporting, but it's also meant covering some international stories and national stories and providing kind of an angle that is not necessarily available elsewhere. And probably the angle that we do least is what I would call Philadelphia regional, because you can get that everywhere else on all the Philadelphia stations. So we downplay the Philadelphia. We do a lot local, a lot of Delaware, and a lot of the world, and we let the Philadelphia media handle in between, because obviously you're going to have 6 TV stations covering the latest murder in Philly. having said that, and this more or less segues from what our other guest panelists have said, I think the big problem today, and I do classify it as a problem, maybe that makes me an old-timer purist, is there almost is a disconnect. People say that they don't want opinionated news, just the facts, let me process it. And indeed, there's a small minority of the American public who watch C-SPAN religiously. But I think especially truer for younger generational groups, a lot of people get their news almost by default. They get it from Howard Stern, they get it from the morning show, they get it from late night TV. They don't necessarily watch a traditional newscast or read a traditional newspaper. And the interesting thing is going to be to see how that group passes age 25 or age 30 and how much traditional news will then be a part of that group's life. I know from lecturing at journalism classes at colleges and high schools, if you do a current events test, if you mention things going on right now, the amount of current events knowledge is significantly less than was the case in my generation, although I would argue that was probably activated in part by civil rights, Vietnam, Watergate, all that. It ain't happening that way now. I mean, there are editors of high school papers who are not necessarily passionate about journalism the way we were.
Let me take